I remember my very first encounter with an instrument was with a harpsichord because my parents had a harpsichord at their house. They had different instruments, of course, violins and a grand piano, but I was too small to reach the piano. So the logical decision for my dad was to sit me behind the harpsichord and teach me some boogie woogie stuff. I probably ruined the harpsichord within a week because playing boogie woogie on a harpsichord, it's a very sensitive instrument. So it was always out of tune. And later on, I think when I was 4 or 5, I started to tune the harpsichord. I started to learn how to tune the harpsichord. So if my dad wanted to play some classical stuff, and I was ruined it before, I tuned it up before he started to play classical stuff. Uh, no, they had really big faith in me, and they let me do almost anything. You have to know that my dad was a huge jazz lover, and he had like a massive collection of jazz records. He also listened to classical music, but when I was in the room, he always put some jazz on, and he was listening from Oscar Peterson to Ella Fitzgerald, Count Basie, Duke Ellington, all the greats, and Jimmy Smith. He also, when I was a kid, he built an organ himself. So there was like a kit, and I remember there were parts coming in weekly. Like here's the manual, here's like the first keyboard, and that I saw my dad on Sundays like soldering these things, and putting this organ together and made it. My dad's a genius. He can touch anything, it works. And later on, when I was growing up, of course, I could reach the piano, and I was playing for hours a day. I was sitting behind the piano for hours, hours, hours. And a great teacher, he showed me like some classical basics, but sheet music and notation didn't really fly well with me. So I really transported everything into my ear and tried to, play it by ear. And he realized that pretty quickly, but we learned a little bit. I can still read, but very slowly these days. I don't really have to read. I think I have great ears, so I can listen to something and I play it really quickly. So that I had very early on. Later, my parents took me to a concert in Zurich. Benny Goodman, Gene Krupa, and Lionel Hampton. Oh my God, that changed my life, that concert. And I can replay the entire concert if it was yesterday, really. Having that experience with 6 years old, I'm thankful for my parents forever. And to the shock of my parents, probably, next day I wanted to play drums, right? So seeing Gene Krupa, I wanted to play drums. What else? And also Lionel Hampton sat behind the drums at the same gig and played drums, and I was all into drums, like every kid. And then next day, I remember I started to build my own drums with boxes, and of course that didn't last long because it was smashed after like 30 minutes, and my parents were like, "Hey, what are you doing here?" But they were very faithful, and later they bought me a kid's kit, like a smaller version of a regular sized drum kit. And then, of course, my brother Chris, he was a great piano player at that time already. So we played together. I played with my dad. I played with my brother. We played with 4 hands, sometimes with 6 hands. That was a fun time. And we had the luck to be in an apartment where it's all office buildings. So after 5 o'clock, nobody was in the house. We were like the first floor. Nobody was in the house, and we could just play. I remember that one day I was maybe like 13 years old. My brother came home. He was more into pop at that time, and I was more into jazz, ironically, because today it's the opposite. He's more a jazz musician. I'm more a pop musician. I still listen to jazz, though. But he brought home a Jeff Lorber album. It was called Private Passion, and it had tons of singers on it, some instrumental tunes, and it changed my life. And I knew from that day on what I wanted to do because it had everything in it. I knew he had some bebop licks, Jeff Lorber playing a little jazz, and it had some nice groove, some programmed drums, and I was totally getting into this songwriting pop zone and that record is really a game changer for me. That and probably Whitney Houston's Saving All My Love for You. Thanks to my brother. He came home with that, and he showed me a lot of stuff, but that particular record was a turning point in my life. And then I started to, getting into drum machines, and a little bit of program was pre-MIDI, I guess, but still, used the first synth and trying to write songs. And, it was a very early, premature stage, but I started to play with like ping pong recording on an old Revox 2-track machine. I started to, maybe multi-track myself with like drums and piano and played a little bass in between. Just writing songs and doing crazy things and getting my experience together. We had a little bigger house, and we had a cellar there, and then I built a recording studio, a full-blown recording studio, step by step, of course. First, I had 4 tracks, then I had 8 tracks, then I had 16, and that's 32 after. And I was doing I was working in a music store, making an apprenticeship, and I slowly started to build, here a little gear, here a little gear. And of course, my parents helped me out tremendously, even financially. They helped me, they bought me some keyboards, and I was a lucky guy. I was a lucky bastard, to be honest with you. And of course, then I spent hours in the cellar trying to, recreate a sound that I've heard maybe on a Quincy Jones record, maybe on a Luther Vandross record, and I try to program like the drums exactly the way it was on that record and try to EQ the bass drum. I spent hours learning that stuff, and I was never satisfied until it sounded like almost the same. So I could switch from A to B and say, okay, well, this sounds almost the same, really. At that time, I was so passionate about it to recreate those sounds from those records. And that also was my sort of my private school in production, recreating all these sounds and trying to learn and understand what they did and learning song structure and bass lines and arrangement and what they did with what chords. And, I spent hours and hours and days and weeks in the studio, besides my apprenticeship, of course, I had to do, but weekends and nights. And, my parents were really easy on me in that regard. They let me do things, they just let me, sometimes they called like at 12 o'clock at night and said, it's really loud down there, or maybe you should go to bed. Well, yeah, that happened a few times. But besides that, my parents were really cool, and that was pre-internet, pre-YouTube. You had to learn it all like in a different way. Of course, learn listening to records and try to recreate it.